I am connected to Minnesota in that I was born and raised in Minnesota. I was born and raised in a small town right outside of New Ulm, Minnesota, a little town called St. George. And it's very, very tiny, but I grew up on a farm outside of St. George. My role was to be the good girl, the good girl. I really felt like that was my role, and I had to be this role model, which was burdensome, you know. I felt like I had a loving childhood. I knew my parents loved me, although there weren't hugs, there weren't kisses, there was no affection that I remember. But I knew they loved me. Growing up, I remember church, God, nuns in school being very important to my family and very much a set of folks that were watching me, you know, and making sure I was that good person. So church was very important. Farm life out in the country was very freeing feeling for me. I also had an uncle that did um, abuse me in some ways. And so I think that was also a confining thing for me. It was at a young age, you don't know what that means, and something feels wrong. And so it kind of just sort of led into that feeling of trying to be a good girl because church and faith and, my parents' faith, it was just so strong that there was something wrong about, the uncle, which made me think maybe I was doing something wrong. And that just shaped my decisions in life, which meaning that it wasn't a good decision, that I made about getting married, because I didn't come into that time in my life where I was thinking clearly, or I really hadn't dealt, with Leo. And it's so funny because in her generation, she just said, "Oh, well, there's all kinds of women that had that done to them when they were young." And that was her only response. And I said, "Oh gosh, Mom, so that makes it okay." And that was fine with me because I totally understood, her generation, and she wasn't capable. A lot of respect for my grandma, who could be in farm clothing, scarf, hat, get out in the dead of winter and do chores on the farm, get dirty, and then she could get all dressed up in her costume jewelry and wear her hats and be glamorous. And so I feel that same I feel the same way. We did a lot of physical work on the farm. I love to physically be active, and probably abused my body throughout the years, but and just to walk barefoot in the pig barns and let that pig shit just come up between your toes. And I loved that. I loved getting dirty, but then I loved getting dressed up and being very much a girl, too. And that was kind of like my grandma, she cleaned up really well. I knew early on that I wanted to be a nurse, but there was a lot of caregiving growing up, and it just came real natural. And sometimes to a fault. I started out as a candy striper, early on. I started out as a candy striper, and then a nurse's aide, and then an LPN. I worked in New Ulm for a while, and then I moved to the cities with a girlfriend and worked at what was St. Luke's Hospital in St. Paul. And then I went to a clinic, worked in family practice in St. Paul, and then got married. And after I got married, I got pregnant right away. About 9 months later, had Emily, and decided because that's what my mom did. I was going to be a stay-at-home mom. There was no question about it. I was going to be a stay-at-home mom. And that's probably one of my, I probably look at that as one of my biggest accomplishments, you know, to be a stay-at-home mom. There were some messages from growing up that now when I look back, it was a lot of hard work. It was, and you did all this for everyone. You did things for everyone. You went out of your way. You did not take care of yourself. And the main thing was, you will be rewarded in the end. That was the big saying. You will be rewarded in the end. Yep, yep. And you don't take care of yourself. You take care of everyone else, and your reward will be in the end. So, you know, I took those messages so strongly. I don't not think as strongly as my siblings did, but you know, if I was sitting in church, and we went to church every single day as a little girl, if I was sitting in church, then, you know, you saved room for your guardian angel, and God was watching you all the time. He was always watching you no matter where you were. So I took that fear of being watched, you know, all the time, and any little thing that I didn't, that maybe wasn't right, you know, then it was a wrong. And I mean, that led to not sleeping at night and wondering if I did something wrong, and I'm going to wake up in a pit of fire, which is hell. I mean, there were some really strong messages I took. Although the nuns and the priests weren't scary to me because they were friends to, you know, to my parents, and they would, you know, come for dinner and things like that. They weren't scary to me, but the message was scary. The message was scary. And so that would be the negative, probably, growing up, never being asked your own opinion about something. The biggest thing for me was the divorce and what that did to my parents, more my mom than my dad. She could not let go of it. And so it was just a constant, it was just something I constantly lived with, and knew that I disappointed them so greatly. And that was so hard on me. But I went home, you know, they needed me. I decided a long time ago that I'm not going to volunteer at church in my spare time. I'm not going to do that. My parents need me. They both had their illnesses, dad before mom, and then mom. And so I went home very regularly and was their nurse. Dad died in his home, and he'd say to other siblings, she's so good to me, you know, like he was talking about me, but I would never get that verbal confirmation, except one day I was staying overnight. It was my, you know, turn during hospice. He was in hospice at home for 6 months, and I had to go to work in the morning, and I'd been there for several days. And there's one thing that each one of them said that I will never forget. And I was leaving for work. Dad was in his hospice bed, and I was leaving for work, 6 in the morning. And he said to me, I'm going to miss you. And that was the most he had said verbally, probably ever in my life, to show me that, you know, he appreciated me. Mm-hmm. When mom died 3 years ago, she fell in the bathroom and broke her hip at 92. She went to the hospital. My brother called me, and so I immediately left and went down and I walk into the ER, and she said to me, I am so glad you are here. And that was one of those lines, just like Dad had said, that made me realize, oh my gosh, she's giving me a compliment. I feel like having Emily print, Emily does a lot of prints for different things. I want her to print, I'm going to miss you. And I want her to print, I'm so glad you're here. It's like those two things that my parents said that I'll never forget. Yeah. That was like a huge compliment. Yeah.